Somewhere deep in the Soviet Union, in a closed military city, a group of senior engineers and generals is huddled in a briefing room. On the wall, there are grainy photos of American satellites, diagrams of the U.S. space shuttle, and, circled in red, the words Strategic Defense Initiative. They are angry, worried, and beneath the rhetoric, genuinely afraid. Across the ocean, the United States has just announced a bold vision, using space itself as a shield against nuclear attack. American scientists are talking openly about lasers in orbit, interceptor satellites, and a future in which Soviet missiles could be shot down before they ever reach American soil. In public, Moscow calls this propaganda, a fantasy, a bluff. In private, Soviet planners know better. They have seen what American technology can do, from the industrial miracle of World War II to the precision electronics and advanced satellites of the 1970s and 80s. They know that when Americans decide to build something big, the world changes. And they scramble to respond with their own Star Wars weapons, including a secret anti-satellite system that Western analysts would later call a Phantom, a weapon conceived to hunt American satellites, rushed into development in the 1980s, never fully operational, and effectively lost when the Soviet Union collapsed. To understand why this Phantom system matters, you have to understand how much the United States had already transformed warfare from above. By the late 1970s, American power in space was no longer just a symbolic flag on the moon. The U.S. had built what was essentially a nervous system around the planet. There were early warning satellites in highly elliptical orbits, staring down at the Earth's limb to detect the infrared flare of any Soviet missile launch within seconds. There were reconnaissance satellites mapping airfields, missile silos, naval bases, and troop concentrations across the Warsaw Pact. Experimental navigation constellations, the ancestors of GPS, were being tested to guide ships, aircraft, and eventually precision-guided munitions. Communications satellites tied together fleets in the Atlantic and Pacific, connected missile submarines under the Arctic ice to command centers in Nebraska, and gave American leaders an unblinking view of the crisis map in real time. For U.S. war planners, space was no longer the final frontier. It was high ground that America controlled. For Soviet planners, that reality was terrifying. They knew that in any serious confrontation, if American satellites remained in place and Soviet space assets were degraded, the Red Army would be blind, mute, and outmaneuvered. That fear is what drove the first Soviet anti-satellite program, the Istrebitel Sputnikov, or IS, literally the satellite fighter. Development began in the early 1960s, but it wasn't until November 1968 that the Soviets could claim a clear success. A target satellite, Cosmos 248, was destroyed by an interceptor, Cosmos 252, which maneuvered into a nearby orbit and detonated its warhead within about a 5-kilometer kill radius. The concept was brutal and simple. An interceptor sat on top of its cyclone booster at Baikonur. When activated, it was launched into a coplanar orbit with the target, used onboard radar to close the distance, and then exploded, spraying shrapnel into space. Over the 1970s, Moscow conducted dozens of such tests. Declassified Western analyses count around 23 launches tied to the IS series, with tests from 1976 onward showing that the Soviets could often achieve lethal intercepts within 1 or 2 orbits of launch. In February 1973, the system was declared operational, and a modernized version, capable of hitting higher altitude targets, reached operational status in 1979. On paper, this was a formidable answer to American space dominance. But here is where the contrast and the seed of American pride really appears. The IS system was heavy, crude, and messy. Every test that ended in a detonation filled the test altitude with clouds of debris. Intercepts took hours. The system depended on launching an entire satellite to kill a single satellite. And as Soviet leaders watched American electronics, computing, and missile technology leap ahead, it became clear that this was not the future. In 1983, General Secretary Yuri Andropov announced a unilateral moratorium on further IS testing, effectively freezing the system in place. At precisely the same time, the United States was testing far more refined concepts. An air-launched ASM-135 missile fired from an F-15, which in 1985 successfully hit a defunct American satellite at more than 500 kilometers in altitude with a direct kinetic impact, no explosive warhead, just pure guidance and precision. American engineers had built a satellite killer that rode to altitude on a fighter jet, climbed above the atmosphere, and struck its target head-on. The contrast between a sleek U.S. missile and a lumbering Soviet co-orbital bomber was impossible to ignore. Then came the moment that sent shockwaves through every Soviet design bureau. Ronald Reagan's Strategic Defense Initiative speech in March 1983. On television, Reagan asked a provocative question. What if the United States could render nuclear missiles impotent and obsolete by building defenses in space? He spoke about lasers, interceptors, particle beams, technologies that to many American scientists still seemed decades away. But in Moscow, the reaction was not skepticism, it was panic. The Soviet leadership, influenced by their own deeply bureaucratic, secretive system, often assumed that whatever American politicians said publicly represented the tip of an iceberg of classified capability. They already knew that American industry could outbuild them. World War II had proven that in dramatic fashion with tanks, aircraft, and ships. They knew that American microelectronics, computing, and optics had pulled far ahead in the 1970s and 80s. They already saw the way early warning and reconnaissance satellites gave U.S. forces near real-time insight into Soviet deployments. So when Reagan described a future of space-based interceptors and lasers, they took him at his word. The internal Soviet reply was a flurry of Star Wars projects of their own, desperate, ambitious, and ultimately unsustainable. At NRO Energia, the main Soviet spacecraft design bureau, engineers were ordered to come up with space-based strike systems. By the early 1980s, Energia had put two concepts on the table: Skif, a laser-armed platform to engage targets in low Earth orbit, and Cascade, a guided missile platform designed to attack satellites in higher and geostationary orbits. Skif would evolve into an enormous spacecraft nicknamed Pole or Polyus that Western writers would later call the Soviet Death Star, a 70 to 80-ton station wrapped around a 1-megawatt carbon dioxide laser derived from weapons already tested aboard an IL-76A-60 airborne laser laboratory. Cascade, while less famous, was meant to house interceptor missiles that could reach tens of thousands of kilometers into space and threaten even geostationary satellites. On top of that, separate teams at the Sary Shagan test range in Kazakhstan continued to develop Terra-3, a complex of high-energy Ruby and CO2 lasers officially for missile defense research, but very clearly applicable to blinding satellites and testing space weapon concepts.
To the American audience, this is where the story becomes almost cinematic. It looks like something out of science fiction. The Soviet Union, struggling under economic stagnation, is trying to build its own space battle station. Polyus Skif was to be launched not on some old R-7 variant, but on the brand-new Energia Super Heavy rocket, capable of lifting around 95 tons into low Earth orbit. The spacecraft bus adapted hardware from previous space stations and TKS resupply craft, mounting enormous carbon dioxide tanks, two 1.2-megawatt turbo generators, and a massive rotating turret to point the laser beam. Its hull was stretched, long and thin, so it could be strapped to the side of the Energia core, riding into space piggybacked like a giant rifle. Internally, the plan was to use a continuous wave gas laser developed by NPO Energomash under the direction of NPO Astrofysica, with Energomash's experience in fluorine-based rocket engines giving them a foundation for high-energy lasers. Engineers had to create extensive test stands on the ground just to learn how to run the laser in vacuum conditions and under automatic control, something far beyond any previous Soviet experience. Meanwhile, at Sary Shagan, Terra 3 stood as a physical manifestation of Soviet ambitions and anxieties. Built in the 1970s as part of anti-ballistic missile research, the complex eventually housed high-energy ruby and carbon dioxide lasers developed by Astrofysica, along with precision tracking optics and control systems managed by the Vimpel Design Bureau. In 1984, at Defense Minister Dmitry Ustinov's insistence, one of Terra 3's low-power lasers was used to track the U.S. Space Shuttle Challenger as it flew over the range, an experiment that later spiraled into rumors in the West that the Soviets had attacked the shuttle with a laser beam. When American scientists finally visited a Terra 3 facility in 1989 under Glasnost, they found lasers roughly 1,000 times less powerful than the U.S. Navy's Miracle test laser, leading them to dismiss Terra 3 as non-operational as a real weapon. Yet documents and Soviet officials acknowledged that Terra 3 had been a valuable research platform, generating detailed data on how lasers interacted with missile bodies and re-entry vehicles, and that its first real applications would have had to be limited ASAT operations, blinding optical sensors rather than burning through structures. Now bring the focus back to the Phantom itself. Within this ecosystem of IS co-orbital fighters, Skif Cascade battle stations, and Terra 3 lasers, there were additional, less documented efforts. One of them, often referenced only obliquely in Western writing, is the Naryad system, a high-altitude co-orbital ASAT concept riding on a UR-100N ICBM, designed to deploy multiple warheads capable of reaching targets in geosynchronous orbit, up to something like 40,000 kilometers away. Another appears in anecdotal descriptions as a prototype laser at Sary Shagan capable of damaging or disabling an obsolete Soviet satellite in test, but canceled in the face of treaty constraints and technical limits. These programs never matured into public, named weapons fielded in large numbers. Instead, they exist today as fragments, mentions in declassified reports, photographs of test hardware, recollections by retired officers. It is in this gray zone that the idea of a phantom anti-satellite weapon system from the 1980s takes shape, a catch-all term for a Soviet ASAT project intended to counter American satellites, heavily funded in the wake of SDI, veiled in secrecy, but never fully operationalized and effectively lost with the collapse of the Soviet state. From an American narrative standpoint, this phantom is compelling because of what it reveals about relative power. Think about the timeline. In the early 1980s, Soviet co-orbital ASATs were being tested at about 1 intercept per year, relying on blowing up satellites and littering orbits with debris. Terra 3 was powerful enough to do sensor blinding in principle, but not anywhere near the mythical killer laser portrayed in some U.S. debates. Polyus Skif was rushed into existence, with major design decisions changed midstream. Astrophysica's original plan for a Drafe laser, plus an auxiliary KBCHA system, proving too heavy for Proton and forcing a switch to Energia. By contrast, the United States, even as it explored exotic SDI ideas, continued to strengthen its core space support architecture, better early warning satellites in geostationary orbit, more reliable communication links, upgraded space surveillance network capable of tracking thousands of objects, and experimental interceptors like the homing overlay experiment that proved kinetic kill in mid-course was technically achievable. American progress was steady, systemic, and underpinned by a robust economy and electronics industry. Soviet progress was lumpy,
brilliant bursts of ingenuity wrapped around serious structural weaknesses. When Polyus finally rolled to the launch pad in May 1987, stacked alongside the Energia booster, it embodied both Soviet ambition and vulnerability. Energia's massive engines roared to life, and on that first flight, the rocket itself performed almost flawlessly, delivering its payload to the proper trajectory. But the spacecraft had been given a complex post-separation maneuver. After release, Polyus was supposed to rotate 180 degrees, fire its own engine, and raise itself into a stable 280-kilometer orbit at about 65 degrees inclination. Instead, due to a software or sensor error, the rotation sequence misexecuted. Polyus ended up pointing its engine in the wrong direction. When it fired, it did not climb into orbit. It effectively pushed itself back down into the atmosphere, re-entering over the Pacific and breaking apart. The Soviet Death Star died on its first day, leaving behind nothing but telemetry traces and a glaring hole in the Soviet answer to SDI. For American viewers, this is a moment that feels almost symbolic. The rival battle station literally cannot get off the ground, while American satellites continue to circle the globe, feeding data into NORAD, SAC, and the Pentagon. In the late 1980s, as glasnost took hold, some of the Western myths about Soviet space weapons, especially lasers, were quietly punctured. CIA assessments that had, in classified form, already painted a more modest picture of Terra 3 and related programs were grudgingly acknowledged as closer to the truth than the public worst-case scenarios. Visiting American scientists saw Sary Shagan's facilities up close and concluded that Soviet lasers were generations behind U.S. efforts, like Miracle, and nowhere near posing a strategic threat. Soviet officials themselves joked that sometimes the American public had a more accurate picture of their country's capabilities than their own citizens did, because the Soviet military had spent so long exaggerating inwards to secure budgets. Meanwhile, internal documents show that Terra 3 and the whole Sary-Shagan laser complex had more value for research on missile defense and space tracking than as actual operational weapons. The gap, what American commentators called a laser gap, turned out to be mythical, heavily skewed by politics. That realization can evoke a quiet kind of pride in your American viewer. Their own system had not only outbuilt the Soviets, but had been more honest in many ways about what was and what was not possible. Then, almost without warning, the Soviet system that had sustained all of these programs collapsed. Between 1989 and 1991, the USSR dissolved into 15 independent states. Budget lines vanished. Military research institutes in Russia, Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and other republics suddenly found themselves without funding. Skilled engineers took on whatever work they could find, or left defense entirely. Space programs that were already under strain, like Skif follow-ons, Cascade missile platforms, and advanced co-orbital concepts like Naryad, were either canceled or allowed to wither away on paper. There was no money to restart Polyus after its failure. There was no political will to revive full-scale ASAT testing in space, especially as Moscow tried to position itself as a responsible actor in post-Cold War arms control. The result, looking back, is dramatic. An entire branch of high technology in the Soviet Union effectively died in place. Hardware sat in warehouses, prototypes gathered dust, technical documentation remained in classified archives, not accessible even to younger engineers who might have been able to learn from it.
This is what modern writers mean when they say the phantom anti-satellite systems technology was lost. It is not that the laws of physics were forgotten. It is that the specific, hard-won engineering know-how, the people who knew which valves tended to fail in vacuum, how to align a space-based laser's optics after launch, how to synchronize co-orbital interceptors with ground radar, retired, emigrated, or moved on. There was no smooth handover from one generation to the next, no production line to embed those lessons into hardware.
In the United States, by contrast, expertise about space systems continued to be transmitted through academia, industry, and government labs. American engineers who worked on SDI components later took their skills into missile defense, satellite design, commercial space, and aerospace startups. The U.S. could afford to cancel programs yet keep the knowledge alive. The Soviet Union canceled programs and lost the knowledge with them. You can close this script by tying the Cold War story to the present, reinforcing that sense of American pride and curiosity. Today, Russia is once again testing anti-satellite weapons, direct ascent missiles like the one that destroyed the Cosmos 1408 satellite in 2021, creating a dangerous cloud of debris, and co-orbital inspection satellites that maneuver suspiciously close to Western spacecraft. China has joined the club with its own DA ASAT tests, and experts warn that low Earth orbit is becoming increasingly militarized. But when you look closely at Russian programs, you can still see the shadows of the 1980s. There are echoes of IS in modern co-orbital experiments. There are echoes of Naryad in upper stages repurposed for dual-use roles. And there is a lingering sense that some of the wildest Soviet dreams, laser battle stations, space-based shields, died with Polyus and Terra 3, never to be resurrected on the same scale. For American viewers, that perspective is powerful. The United States went into the space age with a clear long-term vision, satellites as force multipliers, a robust industrial base to build them, a culture of systems engineering to integrate them, and a willingness to invest year after year. The Soviet Union, faced with this lead, responded with flashes of brilliance and enormous, sometimes desperate projects, our Phantom ASAT among them, that strained an already faltering economy and collapsed before maturity. In your series, this becomes a repeatable narrative structure. Each episode starts with American innovation that shocks the Soviets, traces the secret and often chaotic Soviet response, and then reveals how, in the end, U.S. technology, organization, and economic power proved more durable. In this episode, the star is a weapon that almost nobody saw, whose name was never fully known, that lived in the shadow of Reagan's Star Wars and died in the fire of the Soviet collapse. A phantom anti-satellite system born of fear of American satellites, lost to history, while those same American satellites kept on circling, watching, guiding, and quietly winning the Cold War from orbit.